a little bit of a direction of thinking about, well, what are we supposed to do? What's our next steps? So I got this from Ofelia's book when I was a graduate student. Accedere is the Latin word or the root for assessment. And we often don't think about what assessment really means. And assessment means to sit with. So look at these two pictures. As you see, the first picture with the teacher and the student are intimately connected. The teacher is viewing everything that the student is doing. Well, the second one is an assessment where the student is alone taking a test. So this gives you a big picture. We have to remain true to the idea of what assessment is, which is to get a holistic picture of students. The reason why we have tests is because they're practical, right? We can measure a lot of students at the same time. So there are basically two types of assessments, summative and formative, and the reason they're called this way is because of their role in shaping instruction. So summative assessments, sometimes called formal assessments, and formative assessments are sometimes called informal. So what are summative assessments? Summative assessments basically sum up what a person has learned at the end of a unit or at the end of a year. Right? We use this not really to shape instruction, but to gauge if this student has attained a standard, to look at kind of the level of student proficiency within a school or within a district. Okay? And they're referred to as tests. Right? So there can be summative assessments at the state, federal level, and there can be summative assessments at the classroom level. So if I'm a science teacher and I just taught a unit on energy, I might give a test on energy and not intend to teach it again, but I just want to see who got what, right? So those are summative assessments. And it's not so much about the format as it is about the purpose, right? Because I can have an essay as a summative assessment, write to me about what you know about energy, but I'm not going to use it formatively to shape my instruction. And as Kate said about being critical consumers, it's really important to know the limits and the purpose of these tests, right, since we take them. So if you'd like, I brought a reading recommendation for your summer. It's called Measuring Up, What Educational Testing Really Tells Us by Daniel Koretz. And it's a really fast read, and I think it's really important for principals and school leaders to read because it'll help you to think about, what are the limits? What can I use these tests for, and what can't I use these tests for? So imagine yourself on the beach, under an umbrella, with a drink in hand, enjoying this book. Doesn't it make it better? I'll send it to you, or we'll put it up on the website. So formative assessment, we're going to talk a lot about formative assessment today. Formative assessments are just the beginning. It's the doorknob that Ophelia was talking about in a learning progression. What you do with a formative assessment is you're kind of casting the net to see what is it that students know. You're a researcher. Your stance as a researcher. You're trying to see what is it that students know, what don't they know, how do they retain things, how can they express themselves, so that you have the information to design learning. Right? So it's part of a learning progression. It's part of a process. It's not just, I'm going to do a formative assessment and then I'm finished. So formative assessments, you guys, there's a lot of leeway. You can do lots of different things. Running records. Some people call them reading records. I always call them running records. Rubrics, conferences, informal conversations, students' checklists, observations, and I'm sure you guys can think of a lot of other ones. And I wanted to say this about assessment, because it's really important, like we saw those pictures, to keep in mind what is our goal with assessment. So this was by a researcher called Lindquist in the early part of the century, and he said, the only perfectly valid measure of the attainment of an educational objective would be one based on direct observation of the natural behavior of individuals. Direct measurement is based on a sample from the natural or criterion behavior for each individual. So even though we can't do this, what he's basically saying is we need to observe people to understand what they know. And this we can do as classroom teachers sometimes, but it's also sometimes impractical. But I think we need to keep this close to our heart to think about when we're assessing, we're not just measuring up, right? We're not just, what we really want to do as teachers and educators is understand more than just judge. So I'm going to start with the nicest lab. I'm going to move away from the ELA and think about the nicest lab. So what can we do with the nicest lab? Any brave souls here who can tell us what you guys do with the nicest lab? Don't be shy. What do people do with the nicest lab? Wait, someone?
I was going to make a joke. We use it for all of the other things that we are accountable for, like the BESIS and the LAP, and we use it to fill out other data requests.
And that's sincere. I mean, that's the reality of schools, right?
I'll be sincere. The nicest lab, we use it as a learning tool. We break down the four modalities. We give copies to everyone that's has been tested, and every staff member gets a copy of the test. And they review the weaknesses of the formalities, and basically with nicest lab, you don't need a dictionary to figure it out. It's always reading and writing that's the most difficult task for the students, because back to language, back to the way we teach, back to what the good doctor was stating. Everything she says, it depicts right out of the nicest lab. There's nothing new about it, and up until this year, that test was more difficult than the regular ELA exam. Up until this year. This year is a fiasco. But any monolingual child taking that exam would not pass it. So, you know, the emphasis that we're going back to putting on these children is sad. It's really a sad state of affairs. Because when the other young lady came up and was stating all these laws, still, I mean, where's the silver bullet?
Right. So yeah, the nicest lab. I'm happy to hear your criticism, because as critical consumers, you're able to identify what are the sources of bias in the nicest lab. I mean, it's tested grade band. When I was a second grade teacher, my students had to take the 2 to 4 grade test.
Exactly.
How frustrating, right? So we think about, okay, what kind of data am I getting from this? Remember, this session right now is thinking about, well, what can I do with what I have, right? Even Lisa?
Well, I guess I was a little off the question, but I was thinking, you know, the nicest lab is, I will use it to get, you know, teaching, testing skills, because, you know, when the children, for example, in kindergarten, they have to know how to bubble in. Even though they know the answer, they will have to know that this is the way you're going to process you know, whatever the correct answer is. So in my case would be like, you know, teaching the test skills that they need to pass the test, because the test is really very strong for their level. And in the writing part, they do not take any mistake. It's not, you know, have to be correct. So
even Lisa's talking more about how do you prepare students for the nicest lab and use it as an opportunity. I'm going to just take one more comment because I want to continue. Sarafa?
We use it in our school mostly for grouping kids, to begin the groupings, and then, you know, then we also do informal things with kids to see if they're in the right kind of grouping.
So I'm going to just, I've talked to a lot of ESL teachers, and this is kind of what they have decided. So one is identify basic trends across the school. And as a summative assessment, this is totally appropriate, right? You identify trends. Think about, and I don't know your name, but you were saying, and this is probably a trend around the city, is that students do worse in reading, writing, right? Because they require academic language versus the speaking and listening. Determine ESL groupings, and I want to also caution that these ESL groupings are just beginning ESL groupings, because there's a lot of factors. In one project that Kate and Nelson and I worked on, students didn't take the test seriously. They kind of failed the test on purpose. These were high school students. And so if you base the groupings on those results, you're not getting accurate groupings. So you might want to initially based ESL groupings, but then you have to kind of do another kind of assessment, whether it's formal or informal, to determine if those are the correct groupings. You provide proficiency levels to teachers so they have a general picture of their emergent bilingual learners, but it's important that teachers understand what the nicest lot is. It's not, if you give the nicest lot results to teachers and say bye-bye, basically, they're not going to do anything with it, right? So they have to understand what are the proficiency levels, what can I do with it, have a discussion. Well, if all my students have low oral language, then what does that imply for me, right? Again, linking it to intentionality, not just mandates or procedures of handing out the results to teachers. And focusing on specific groups like LTELs, or I know there's different groups like the girls. Are the girls doing worse in oral language, for example? Or Bengali students versus Spanish-speaking students. The groups in you'll know which groups make sense to identify the trends with. But I think this is the most important thing. Once you get those results, it's helpful to start thinking about how to dig deeper, right? These are summative assessments, and remember, summative assessments give you a crude idea of what's happening. But at a school level, you have to investigate and think about why are students achieving at a particular level, right? If I get a score of 98, it doesn't tell me if I got the 98 because I looked at Nelson's paper or if I studied all night long, right? It doesn't tell me the reason why I did it, right? So you have to investigate. Why are students not doing as well in reading and writing and doing better in oral language? Or why are certain students not developing an oral language while others are? These are the types of questions that are important to ask. So, now that we have our nicest lab data, how does it impact student learning and how does it impact our programming? So, as Sarafa, I think, said, initial groupings for ESL and group work, teacher planning for EBLs. So, as a teacher, sometimes I had year-long goals. Once I had a group of students and my goal for that year was oral language, right? So I was planning based on data, thinking, I really need to work on oral language with this group. Or next year, really thinking about nonfiction writing. Making goals based on the data, the large data that you get. And identifying trends between groups and the potential of digging deeper. So if I get my nicest lot scores for my students, then I know that I have certain questions to ask of my students. Why are they performing at certain levels? And you can do it individually too. Why is one student, for example, not testing out? Programming, matching large school trends with specific and differentiated teaching for different groups of EBLs. Again, with the concept of LTELs. If you see that all kids are performing at a certain level and you group them all together, there may be newcomers.
I don't think anybody knows what LTELs are.
Oh, I'm sorry. Long-term English. We need to think of a better term for them. So if anyone has an idea, let us know. So if you base it just on the score, you might be putting groups that really need very different instruction together. And that wouldn't make sense for them. And you can monitor a variety of groups over time. Okay. So summative assessments are useful, but as you can see, I think they're most useful for digging deeper, for asking questions about your students. So what do you not do with summative assessments? They're not supposed to be used formatively. And I'll say this again, they're not supposed to be used informatively. Even though the DOE sometimes asks you to use them formatively, because of the lack of validity with emergent bilingual students, you can't really do that. Because you're working on misguided data, right? If you're working on lies, you're just building a lie, right? So basically, you shouldn't be using it formatively. You should be using it to look at trends. It should not be used for informal or formalized tracking. So once you put them in a group, you don't stick them in the same group. You investigate, Maybe one student who scored low in reading and writing actually is able to not be in that group. You may investigate that and figure that out and be able to move some students, right? And summative assessments that have limited validity, like the ELA, should be used with caution when making conclusions about what students can do.